The first time Frances Hadley walked into Caldwell, Kansas, she did so with 37 cents to her name, a carpet bag held together by borrowed twine, and the particular kind of composure that belongs only to women who have already survived the worst thing they could imagine. It was the spring of 1882, and Caldwell sat right on the edge of everything. The last real town before the Cherokee Strip opened up into nothing but wind and sky, and the kind of silence that either healed a person or swallowed them whole. The cattle drive still moved through in great dusty rivers, and the saloons never fully closed, and the boardwalk buckled where the Texas longhorns had pressed too many years of hooves into the wood. It was not a gentle place. But then, Frances was not looking for gentle. She was looking for work. She had come from Wichita, where her husband of 3 years had died of a fever that moved through the lower quarters of the city like a slow and indifferent hand. Thomas Hadley had been a good man and a kind one, and she had loved him in the way that young women love the first person who makes them feel safe. She was 26 years old now, and she was not the same woman who had married him. Grief had a way of clarifying things. She knew what she needed, and what she needed was a position, and the only position available to a woman of her particular combination of education and poverty was the one advertised in the Caldwell Post, which she had read twice in the back of the mail coach before the paper fell apart at the folds. Wanted, schoolteacher, Cedar Creek Township, Caldwell District. Must be of sound moral character and able to instruct pupils of varied ages in reading, arithmetic, history, and the principles of Christian virtue. Room and board provided. Salary modest but certain. Apply to the school board, care of the post office. Sound moral character. She had almost laughed at that, not from bitterness but from the sheer odd smallness of the requirement when set against everything the frontier demanded of a person. She had moral character in abundance. She had also made cornbread over an open fire, set a broken finger back into place by herself, and once talked a drunk man out of shooting a neighbor's dog. She figured she would do fine. The school board turned out to be 3 men who met her in the back room of the post office, with the careful solemnity of people making a decision they considered enormously important. They asked her about her schooling, her faith, and her willingness to remain unmarried for the duration of her contract, which was a requirement that struck her as both presumptuous and, given the present state of her heart, entirely manageable. She answered everything plainly. They hired her on the spot and offered her lodging in the spare room of the alderman family, whose farm sat 2 miles east of town on a rutted dirt track that turned to mud from April through June. The aldermans were a good family, Jonas, who was thick-armed and spoke in complete sentences, and Ruth, who was thin and sharp-eyed and possessed of an endless capacity for generosity that she expressed primarily through food. They had 4 children, 3 of whom were of school age, and a 5th on the way. They made room for Frances without fuss, cleared a corner of the upper room for her, and gave her a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender and long use. Frances unpacked her carpetbag in 10 minutes and then sat on the edge of her cot and listened to the wind push across the prairie outside and felt something that was not quite peace, but was at least adjacent to it. She started school the following Monday. There were 14 children enrolled, ranging in age from 6 to 15, crammed into a single room that had been built for storing grain before the township decided education was more important than corn. The desks were mismatched, and the roof leaked in one corner, and there were no books beyond 2 battered primers and a Bible so worn the cover had separated entirely from the spine. Frances taught from memory, from invention, from the sheer force of caring about the small faces looking up at her. By the end of the first week, she had sent a letter to a school in Wichita asking for donated books and had organized the older students into tutoring the younger ones. By the end of the second week, 3 children who had never opened a book were beginning to read their names. It was during that second week that she first saw Harlan Reed. He came to the school on a Wednesday afternoon when the children had gone home, and Frances was sweeping the wooden floor with a broom that shed more bristles than it collected dirt. She heard the horse first, a deliberate, measured sound, not the nervous clatter of town horses, but the steady rhythm of an animal that covered distances habitually and without complaint. Then the shadow fell through the open doorway, and she looked up. He was tall and lean in the way that men who worked outdoors became over years of it, not the artificial broadness of someone who had tried to build himself up, but the natural economy of someone who had been worn down to exactly what was necessary. He was 31 years old, she would learn later, though she might have guessed him older purely from the quality of his stillness. He wore a dark coat over a work shirt, and his hat was the kind that had been good once and had since become something more honest than good, shaped by use, darkened at the brim, utterly without pretension. He had dark eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been set once, under some considerable pressure, and never quite relaxed again. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the room with the quiet thoroughness of a man accustomed to reading situations before committing himself to them. "Miss Hadley," he said. It was 2 words, and yet the way he said them communicated a dozen other things: that he knew who she was, that he had come with a purpose, that he intended to state that purpose without preamble or waste. "That is me," she said, resting the broom against the wall. "Can I help you?" He stepped inside just far enough to be out of the sun. "I work for the aldermans. Jonas asked me to bring you this." He held out an envelope, which proved to contain a note from Ruth reminding Frances that supper was at 6, and that the road was muddy from the morning's rain, and that she ought to take the northern path home. Frances took the envelope. Harlan Reed made no move to leave. She waited, having learned early in life that when a person who clearly had something to say did not say it immediately, patience was almost always more effective than prompting. He looked at the walls of the schoolroom, at the alphabet she had written on a long strip of brown paper and tacked above the windows, at the slates lined up along the shelf, at the stack of carefully mended primers on the corner desk. "You did all this," he said. Not a question. "The children helped," she said. He looked at her then with a directness that was not rude but was intensely present, as if he were seeing her in the way that mattered and not bothering with the rest. "Good," he said, and then he left. Jonas Alderman explained it to her that evening over supper, in the way he explained most things, once, accurately, without editorializing. Harlan Reed had been working the alderman land for 5 years. He had appeared one spring morning asking for work, had been given it, had proved himself invaluable in every practical sense, and had remained ever since. He was not from Kansas. Jonas believed he was from somewhere in Texas originally, though Harlan had never confirmed this. He was unmarried. He was reliable as sunrise. He spoke when there was something to say and otherwise went about the business of being useful, and Jonas had found this arrangement entirely satisfactory. Ruth added, without looking up from her mending, that Harlan Reed was the most contained person she had ever encountered, and that she had given up trying to get more than a dozen words out of him per day somewhere around the end of his first year, but that she had never once doubted that he was a good man, which was, she said, worth considerably more than conversation. Frances absorbed this. She slept on it. She woke the next morning and did not think about it particularly, because she had children to teach and a leaking roof to address with the school board and a letter to write to Wichita. But she noticed him after that. It was impossible not to, in the way that quiet things are often impossible not to notice. It was his very stillness that made him conspicuous. He moved around the farm with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made peace with physical labor long ago and found in it something close to meaning. He split wood with a focus that was almost meditative. He repaired fences with a precision that went beyond the requirements of the task. In the mornings, before anyone else was awake, she would sometimes see him from her window standing in the yard looking at the horizon, just looking, in a way that made her wonder what he was thinking and then wonder why she wondered. They saw each other most days. They exchanged perhaps 40 words a week. He would nod to her when she came out for the wagon ride to school. She would thank him when he helped carry books or supplies. Once, when the north wind came up sudden and cold and scattered her lesson papers across the yard, he appeared from nowhere and collected them without being asked, handing them back to her in a neat pile with the slightly shamed expression of a man who was not certain whether unsolicited help was welcome. She had thanked him warmly enough that his expression shifted to something she could not quite read. The weeks turned into months. Frances settled into the rhythms of the school and the farm and the slow geography of Caldwell in a way that surprised her. She had not expected to find comfort in a place so raw and unfinished, but the rawness itself had a kind of honesty she appreciated. The land was exactly what it was. The people, mostly, were the same. She learned the town. She learned which of the school board members could be reasoned with and which required strategic flattery. She learned that the Mercantile on Comanche Street kept better coffee than the one by the stockyards, and that the Caldwell Post published corrections approximately never, and that the cattle drovers who came through in spring were a different species of loneliness than the homesteaders who stuck around year-round. She learned that the Indian Territory just south of town was not the blank and empty place her schooling had suggested, but was the home of people who had been pushed there by the same forces that had pushed a great many others, and she felt the familiar weight of that injustice settle somewhere in her chest, where she kept the things she could not fix but would not pretend were not true. And she kept noticing Harlan Reed. She noticed the way he listened when Jonas spoke about the farm's problems with complete attention, without interruption, as if speech were a gift and inattention a form of theft. She noticed the way he treated the horses, with a gentleness that was matter-of-fact rather than performed. She noticed, on the evening in late April when little Elsa Alderman fell from the hay loft and the whole family went white with fear, that it was Harlan who caught the child's panic with such steady calm that Elsa stopped screaming within seconds, and that, when the doctor confirmed she had only bruised her arm and not broken it, Harlan went out to the barn alone and sat there for a long time by himself, and that Frances, who happened to walk past with a lantern, understood without being told that being steady in a crisis did not mean a person was not also frightened. She thought about that for a long time. Summer came to the Kansas prairie with the subtlety of a freight train, sudden and enormous and relentless. The heat pressed down on Caldwell and baked the dust into plates and turned the schoolroom into something that required open windows and a great deal of patience. Frances kept school through July and then closed for the harvest season, which was the custom, and found herself with more time than she had expected and less to do with it. It was Ruth who suggested she take on some mending from town, which she did, and it was through this that she met most of the women of Caldwell properly, at sewing circles and church, where people talked and she listened, and where she began to understand the social geography of the place the way she had once understood the streets of Wichita. She heard about Harlan Reed in pieces, the way one hears about anyone who will not speak for themselves. A woman named Clara Moss, who was married to one of the cattle agents and therefore knew a great deal of everything, mentioned casually that Harlan Reed had been one of the best range riders in the territory before he had settled at the Alderman place, that he had ridden for 2 or 3 outfits in Texas, and once helped drive a herd all the way to Dodge City. Then, Clara said, lowering her voice with the pleasure of someone delivering significant information, something had happened. Clara did not know exactly what, but he had come back from one drive and simply stopped going out again, settled at the first farm that would have him, did not speak of it. Frances thanked Clara for the coffee and went home thinking about the difference between a man who was quiet because he had nothing to say and a man who was quiet because what he had to say was too heavy to put down in ordinary conversation. She was fairly certain Harlan Reed was the second kind. She also became certain, somewhere in the long hot evenings of August, sitting on the alderman porch with the fireflies beginning their small green arguments in the tall grass, that she was developing an interest in Harlan Reed that went considerably beyond the polite and neighborly. This did not alarm her. She was 26 and had been married and widowed and had crossed 200 miles of difficult country alone, and she had long since stopped being alarmed by the interior movements of her own heart. She examined it honestly, the way she examined most things, and found that what she felt was not infatuation, which was bright and unstable, but something slower and more structural. A recognition, perhaps, of a certain kind of quality. She thought he was lonely in a way that had become so familiar it had started to feel like identity. She thought she might understand something about that. What she did not know how to do was ask. Not because she was afraid of rejection. She had thought about it and decided that rejection from Harlan Reed would be a clean and honorable thing, that he was not the kind of man who would be unkind about it. But because she had a sense, held carefully and without certainty, that the question she wanted to ask was not a simple one, and that asking it wrong would be worse than not asking at all. The question formed itself slowly, the way questions worth asking usually do. She found its final shape on an evening in early September when the heat had broken at last, and the prairie smelled of damp earth and dried grass, and the particular sweetness that comes after the first cooling rain. She had been walking the north path back from town, which she sometimes did on evenings when the wagon was needed for other work, and she had come around the big curve near the creek where the cottonwoods grew thick along the bank, and she had found Harlan there. He was sitting on a flat rock at the water's edge, boots off, feet bare in the shallow water, watching the current move over the stones. He did not hear her approach until she was close, which told her he had been deep in thought because he was ordinarily as alert as a range animal. He looked up. He did not startle. He simply looked. She sat down on a nearby rock without asking permission and took off her own boots because the rock was wide enough for two and the water looked very cool and she was 26 years old and allowed to make her own decisions. They sat in silence for several minutes. The creek spoke for them, which was adequate. Then Frances asked her question. "What is the thing you think about?" she said. "When you are being quiet." She watched him very carefully as she said it. She saw him receive the question, not with surprise exactly, but with something she could only describe as recognition, as if he had been waiting for it without knowing he had been waiting. He was quiet for a long moment. Not the usual quiet of a man who doesn't intend to answer, but the quiet of a man who is deciding whether to trust the fact that the question is real. He said, "My brother." Frances waited. "His name was Cole," Harlan said. "He was 4 years younger than me. He rode with me for 3 seasons on the drives. He had a laugh that you could hear from one end of a cattle line to the other." He stopped. He looked at the water. He turned a stone over in his hand. "He was killed on a drive. 5 years ago. There was a fight at a river crossing. It was one of those things that didn't have to happen, and it happened anyway, and I was 30 feet away and I couldn't get to him in time." He turned the stone over again and then threw it softly into the creek where it made a small round sound and disappeared. "I've been trying to figure out," he said, "ever since then what I was supposed to do with the rest of it, the rest of my life. Whether a person still gets to want things after something like that." Frances sat with that for a moment, giving it the space it deserved. "I think," she said, "that the wanting doesn't ask permission." He looked at her then, and it was the same direct look she had noticed that first day in the schoolroom, but different in quality now, no longer simply observational but something openly searching, as if he were looking for a particular thing and was not quite certain whether he had found it. "No," he said quietly, "I don't suppose it does." And then he kept talking. Not the way a dam breaks, not with the violence of long-held pressure releasing all at once, but in the measured way of a man who has been keeping accounts for a very long time and is finally reading them aloud. He talked about Cole, about the way his brother had been better with horses than any man Harlan had ever known, better even than Harlan himself, and that was saying something. He talked about the Texas hill country where they had grown up, about their mother who had died when Cole was 12 and Harlan was 16, and how they had kept each other from going entirely wrong after that. He talked about the drives, the vastness of them. The way a herd moving at night under a full moon was one of the most beautiful and terrifying things a person could witness. He talked about the river crossing where Cole died, not in detail, not with the particular cruelty of fact, but with the aching preciseness of someone describing a loss they had been carrying alone. He talked about coming to Caldwell, about asking Jonas for work, about the 5 years of working and being useful and saying only what needed saying, because it had seemed to him that the least he could do, given that Cole had not gotten any more days, was to use his own days carefully. He talked about watching Frances teach, which he had done more than she knew, had come to the school on pretext, and once simply stood outside the window for 5 minutes listening to her read to the children, and how something about it, the way she gave the words out freely, as if they cost her nothing, had made him feel, for the first time in 5 years, that the world had more going on in it than loss. He stopped. The creek kept moving. The cottonwoods shifted overhead. The first stars were beginning to appear in the wide Kansas sky, small and certain. "I apologize," he said. "I have been talking a considerable amount." "You have," Frances agreed. "It has been entirely welcome." He looked at her sideways. There was something in his face that she had not seen there before, or not in that combination, a cautiousness still present, but also something lighter, not quite a smile, but the structural precursor to one, the way a window being opened is the precursor to fresh air. "You are not what I expected," he said. "When they said there was a new schoolteacher." "What did you expect?" He considered it. "Someone more frightened," he said. "The women who come out here, the new ones, they're usually frightened of the space, the openness of it. You're not." "I was frightened of something else," she said, "but not of space." She paused. "I was frightened of staying still. Of ending up in a room in Wichita and never finding out what I was for." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Did you find out?" She thought about the 14 children and their slowly growing ability to read. She thought about the leaking roof that she had finally shamed the school board into fixing. She thought about Ruth Alderman, who had become a genuine friend, and about sitting on this rock in the last light of a September evening talking with a man who had not, she suspected, talked this honestly in 5 years. "I think I am still finding out," she said. "I think that is the point." He nodded. It was the nod of a man who found an answer accurate. They walked back to the farm in the dark, not close enough to touch but close enough that she was very aware of him beside her, of the particular gravity of his presence, the way some people have more weight in the world than their bodies alone account for. He held the lantern. She carried her boots. The road was dry and the grass sang quietly in the wind, and she could see every star in the sky. At the gate to the farm lane he stopped. "Miss Hadley," he said. "Frances," she said. "You should call me Frances." Another pause. "Frances," he said, and the way he said it was so careful and deliberate and entirely different from how anyone else said her name that she felt it differently than she had ever felt her own name. "Thank you," he said, "for the question." She smiled. "Thank you for answering it." He went to the barn. She went inside. Ruth was at the kitchen table waiting up, ostensibly mending, actually watching the door with the bright and knowing expression of a woman who had waited out many situations. "You are late," Ruth said. "I was talking," Frances said. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "With Harlan Reed." "Yes." Ruth set down her mending and folded her hands and said, with the tone of someone delivering a verdict they had been composing for months, "Well, it is about time." The next weeks had a different quality than what had come before, not dramatically different, not the rushed and giddy quality of something new, but the particular warmth of something that had been building slowly and had now quietly acknowledged itself. Harlan did not become a talker overnight. The man he was had been shaped by 31 years, and 5 of them had been particularly formative ones, and he was still largely a man of economy. But there was a difference in the economy now. It was no longer the economy of someone who had nothing to spend. It was the economy of someone who was choosing. He came to walk with her in the evenings when the work was done, not every evening, which would have been conspicuous, but often enough that Ruth stopped pretending not to notice, and Jonas began leaving the lantern out on the porch rail. They walked the creek path and the north road and the open pasture on the east side of the farm where the grass was tall and the wind made it move like water. They talked about everything gradually, the way people talk when they are learning each other properly, about her schooling in Ohio, where she had grown up the daughter of a schoolmaster and had absorbed his belief in education the way other children absorbed religion, about his years on the cattle drives, which were hard and beautiful and gone from the world now, or going, the railroad having made them largely unnecessary, about what they both believed and what they were uncertain about, and what they had simply decided was beyond knowing and had made peace with. He asked questions now, and the questions were good ones. He asked how she had decided to become a teacher. He asked what she had felt on the mail coach coming to Caldwell. He asked, one evening with the directness that was purely him, whether she missed Thomas. She thought about it. "I miss who I was when I was with him," she said. "I was younger then, more certain of things. He made me feel safe, and I had not had much of that." She paused. "But I don't think that version of me could have made it out here. I think what happened, as terrible as it was, made me into someone who can." He nodded. "I understand that," he said, "about grief making you into someone. Are you still being made?" she asked. He considered this with the seriousness he gave all real questions. "I think so," he said. "I think I might be being made into someone who can want something again." She did not say anything to that. She did not need to. The evening said it for her, the prairie in September with its enormous, generous sky, the two of them walking it together, the lantern swinging small and warm between them. He kissed her for the first time on a Thursday evening in October, and it was exactly what she would have expected from Harlan Reed, which was to say it was not impulsive or uncertain, but considered and deliberate and entirely genuine. They had been standing on the back porch of the farmhouse after the rest of the household had gone inside, watching the harvest moon come up over the flat edge of the world, and he had turned to her and said her name in that particular way he had, just Frances, with the whole weight of him behind it, and she had looked up, and his face had been very close, and he had put his hand very gently against her jaw and kissed her. It lasted only a moment. He pulled back and looked at her with that searching directness and said, "Was that all right?" "Yes," she said. "That was very all right." He nodded. Something in his face completed itself. "Good," he said. And then he kissed her again, which was considerably less brief. She told Ruth the next morning, and Ruth, who had been performing elaborate tasks near windows and doors for 6 weeks, simply said, "Finally," and hugged her with the fierce warmth of someone who has genuinely wanted a thing to happen. Jonas shook Harlan's hand that evening and said with his characteristic economy, "Good. About time," which Frances reflected might well become the general verdict of the situation. What followed was the happiest autumn of Frances Hadley's life, and she was aware of it even as it was happening, which was a gift she had not expected. She had expected grief to be followed by neutrality, by the restoration of something like balance. She had not expected this particular warmth that came from being known by a specific person, and from knowing them in return, from walking in the October cold with a man who did not waste words, and therefore made every one of them count. Harlan brought her a book, a volume of history he had found at the general store in Caldwell, pressed into a stack of goods that had come in on the supply wagon, probably by accident, definitely treasured now. He handed it to her without ceremony, just held it out, and when she opened it and found it was a collection of essays on the natural history of the plains, she was so genuinely pleased that something moved through his face that she thought might be the closest he had ever come to joy in 5 years. She read to him sometimes in the evenings. Not to the children, just to him, sections that she thought he would find interesting, and he would listen with his whole attention the way he listened to everything, and occasionally he would ask a question that revealed he had been thinking about it carefully, and she found these conversations, the ones that grew from her reading and his thinking, to be among the best she had ever had. The school board renewed her contract for the following year without being asked. The books from Wichita arrived, a whole crate of them, donated by the city school, slightly battered and enormously welcome. Frances unpacked them in the schoolroom with her oldest students helping, and when they opened the crate and the smell of old paper came out of it, every child in the room went quiet with the particular reverence that is appropriate to books, and Frances made a mental note to tell Harlan about it later. She had begun to measure days partly by what she would tell him. The question of the future presented itself in November, when the first real cold came down from the north and reminded everyone that the Kansas winter was not a gentle thing. Harlan came to her on a Sunday afternoon while Jonas and Ruth were at church. They had stayed home on account of Elsa's continuing cough, and they sat together in the kitchen with cups of coffee and the fire going and the wind outside pressing against the glass. "I have been thinking," Harlan said, "about what happens next." She waited. "I have been at the Alderman's for 5 years," he said. "It is good work and Jonas is a good man and I have been grateful for it. But I have been thinking that I would like to have something of my own." He looked at her steadily. "I looked at a piece of land about 8 miles north of here, 40 acres. There is a creek on it and the soil is good. It is available at a fair price. I have been saving for a long time and I have enough for the first payment." He stopped. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I am asking you," he said, "whether that is something you would want to be part of." Frances had been a schoolmaster's daughter and a schoolteacher herself and had spent her life trying to say things precisely, and she knew when a man was saying something more specific than the words on its surface. She looked at him for a long moment, at the careful and entirely genuine face of him, and said, "Are you asking me to marry you, Harlan?" "Yes," he said, "I am asking you to marry me." "Then yes," she said, "I will." He let out a breath she had not quite realized he was holding, and something in his whole body seemed to settle, the way a house settles when it has finally found its foundation. "Good," he said, and then, with something that was unmistakably a smile, "I have been working up to that for some weeks." "I know," she said. "Was it obvious?" "Only to people who were paying attention." He took her hand across the table, which was not a grand gesture but was absolutely the right one, and held it in both of his in the careful way he did everything, as if he understood its value. They married in December, at the small church in Caldwell, with Jonas and Ruth as witnesses, and every one of Frances's 14 students in attendance, which had not been planned but which no one was able to prevent, the children having decided unanimously that the wedding of their teacher was a matter of community importance. The preacher was a broad and earnest man named Reverend Holt, who performed the ceremony with genuine feeling, and who, Frances noted with private amusement, seemed somewhat surprised when Harlan Reed, who he had known for 5 years as a man of minimum words, spoke his vows with a quiet and absolute conviction that filled the entire small church. The vows were simple. Frances had written her own and Harlan had learned hers by heart and recited them back to her, slightly changed, because he was constitutionally unable to promise anything he had not thought through, and what he promised her was exact and true, and she memorized every word. He promised to be honest with her. He promised to work. He promised to listen when she needed to be heard. He promised to tell her the true things even when they were hard. He promised, in a sentence that made Ruth cry quietly into her handkerchief, to remember that she had taught him that the rest of life was still worth having. She promised him the same things in return and meant them entirely. After the ceremony, which was modest and warm and perfect in the way that things are perfect when the people in them are actually present, there was a supper at the alderman table, and Jonas produced a bottle of good whiskey, and even Ruth had a small glass. And Harlan sat beside Frances for the whole evening with his hand at the back of her chair, not possessively, but with the absolute certainty of someone who has found where he belongs. They moved into the farmhouse on the 40 acres north of Caldwell in February of 1883, and it was not a large house. It was a single-story structure with 2 rooms that Harlan had begun to build in October and finished in January with Jonas's help, and the help of 2 neighbors who were repaid in labor rather than cash, as was the custom. The house was sound and well-made, because Harlan did everything sound and well-made, and it smelled of fresh lumber and cold air, and Frances walked through it the first time with her hand trailing along the wall, feeling the solidity of it, and thought that she had never owned a thing so real. She hung her books on a shelf he had built for them. He hung his tools in the small outbuilding with a precision that she recognized as his version of the same impulse. They arranged the kitchen together, debating the placement of shelves with the seriousness of people to whom practicality was a genuine value, and then stood back and looked at what they had made, and Harlan said, quietly and simply, "Home." She agreed. She kept her teaching position, riding to the schoolroom 3 days a week in winter and 5 in spring, because she was not willing to give up the work, and Harlan had never suggested she should. He drove her in the wagon when the roads were bad, and had the horse ready on other mornings, and sometimes appeared at noon with a parcel of food, because the ride was long, and he understood that she forgot to eat when she was thinking about lesson plans. She found this particular form of attention practical, unannounced, completely without drama, to be among the things she loved most about him. Love had arrived steadily, like water finding its level, not in a moment, not with a single declaration, but through the accumulated weight of all the small true things. The way he set a second cup of coffee on the table without being asked, because he had learned, in the first weeks, that she drank too. The way he said good morning to her, with a completeness of attention that made it feel less like a greeting and more like a decision, as if he were choosing to begin the day with her as its center. The way he talked in the evenings now, not constantly, not more than his nature required, but genuinely about the farm and the sky and the book she had left out, and the thing the eldest alderman boy had said that was unexpectedly funny, and the way he listened to everything she said with the particular quality of a man who considers speech a gift. She loved him. She was sure of it in the way she was sure of geography and arithmetic, not with the electric certainty of romance novels, but with the deep and grounded certainty of something proven by repeated testing. Spring came to their 40 acres with a generosity that felt personal. The creek that ran along the east boundary came up full and clear, and the cottonwood along its bank went green, and Harlan planted the first field with the focused attention he brought to all things, and Frances planted a kitchen garden behind the house with a determination that somewhat exceeded her experience, but that produced, by midsummer, sufficient vegetables to supplement their table considerably. She had her students plant seeds in small clay pots as a lesson in natural science, which Jonah's alderman's youngest boy took so seriously that he became something of a nuisance to his mother about indoor plants for the next 18 months. The cattle trade was changing. The railroad now ran close enough to Caldwell that the long drives were increasingly unnecessary, and the range that had once been open was being fenced by homesteaders coming in from the east, and there was a friction in the land between the old way of doing things and the new that sometimes turned into genuine conflict. Harlan watched it with the careful attention of a man who had lived on both sides of that line, and said, on a spring evening when they could see the smoke from a distant fence dispute on the horizon, that he did not think conflict was the answer, but that he also understood why men who had ridden open range for 10 years did not know what to do with themselves when the range was gone. It was the longest unprompted speech she had heard from him on a practical matter, and she thought about it for days afterward. There was a morning in early June when a rider came to their gate, a young man, probably not more than 19, with the dusty and exhausted look of someone who had been traveling for several days without adequate rest or food. He said he was looking for work. Harlan considered him for a moment. She watched him from the kitchen window and then said, without particular drama, to come in and eat first. The young man's name was James Bauer, and he was from Missouri, and he had come west on an idea that had proved more complicated than advertised. Harlan fed him and talked with him with his characteristic straightness, and then told him the truth, which was that there was work enough for a man who was willing, but that the frontier was not magic and the work was real, and that if James wanted to help with the second field in exchange for food and the use of the outbuilding until he found a permanent position, the offer was open. James Bauer stayed for 3 months, worked with considerable dedication, and eventually went on to a ranch 40 miles north where he remained for many years. But before he left, he said to Frances, with the artlessness of youth, that he had never met a man who said less and meant more than Harlan Reed, and that it had been an education. Frances agreed with this assessment and told Harlan what James had said, and Harlan received it with the expression he wore when something surprised him in a way he found acceptable, a slight widening of the eyes and a slow nod. By the summer of 1883, Caldwell had changed enough that Frances noticed it clearly. The wildness of the place was being sanded down at the edges, not entirely, not quickly, but undeniably. There were more families. There was a second school being discussed for the western part of the district. The hotel had been rebuilt in brick. The cattle drives still came through, but they were thinner, less frequent, and the cowboys who rode them had a slightly different quality, more tired, perhaps, or more aware that what they were doing was becoming historical even as they did it. She talked to her students about it, about change and what it meant, about the fact that the world they were growing up in was different from the one their parents had entered, and that this was neither simply good nor simply bad, but complex in the way that all true things are complex, and that the most useful thing a person could do was pay attention and think clearly. Harlan sat in on this lesson one afternoon, having ridden to town on an errand and arrived at the school to find it mid-session, and he stayed in the back and listened. Several of the older students had seen him before and were too practiced at their lessons to be distracted. The younger ones stared at him until he gave them the look that meant he was not interesting, which worked. After the students left, he helped her stack the primers and sweep the floor, as he often did when he was there, and then said, "You told them a difficult thing today." "They should know difficult things," she said. "That's rather the point." "Yes," he said, "but you told it to them in a way that gave them tools. Most people, when they tell difficult things, just deliver the difficulty and leave." She looked at him. "That was a very perceptive observation. I have been listening to you for nearly a year," he said. "Some of it was going to stick." She laughed, a real one, full and sudden, the kind she had not had much practice with before this year, and he looked at her with that expression she had come to know best, the one that was not quite a smile on his face but was entirely a smile in his eyes. She was pregnant by September. She told him on a Tuesday morning before he left for the field, simply and directly, because that was how she had learned to tell him things, and it was the way he received them best. He was standing by the kitchen door with his hat in his hand, and she said she needed to tell him something. He turned around and looked at her with his full attention. She told him. He was quiet for a long moment. Not the old quiet, not the quiet of a man withholding himself from the world, but the quiet of a man absorbing something enormous. Then he set his hat down on the table very carefully and crossed the kitchen and put both arms around her and held her in the complete and deliberate way he did everything, and she put her face against his chest, and they stood there in the September morning with the sunlight coming through the kitchen window, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. After a time he stepped back and looked at her face and said, "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. He nodded. He picked his hat back up. He went to the door and then stopped and turned around. "Frances," he said. "Yes." He looked at her with the full weight of everything he was, the man who had carried his brother for 5 years, who had worked in silence and come back to himself one question at a time, who had built a house and meant his vows and brought her coffee in the morning without being asked. "Thank you," he said, "for this, for all of it." She felt the familiar sting behind her eyes that she never quite suppressed. "We haven't done anything yet," she said. "We've just started." "I know," he said. "That is what I'm thanking you for." He went to the field. She sat down at the kitchen table and pressed both hands flat on the wood surface and breathed. And outside through the window the Kansas sky was enormous and blue and full of everything still to come. Ruth Alderman came the following Sunday and brought a quilt she had been making since June on the strength of, as she said, a strong instinct, and sat with Frances in the kitchen for 3 hours while Jonas and Harlan argued pleasantly about the drainage on the north edge of the property. Ruth talked about childbirth with the no-nonsense clarity of a woman who had done it 5 times and expected to do it again. And Frances listened carefully and asked questions and felt, by the end of the afternoon, considerably more prepared. The winter of 1883 was a hard one, not catastrophic, not the kind that broke people, but steady and cold and demanding in the way that required constant maintenance and a great deal of firewood. Harlan had cut enough wood in October that they were never cold, but he went out every morning and checked the animals and the roof and the water supply with the care of a man who understood that vigilance was a form of love. Frances taught her winter classes and came home in the short afternoons to the warm house and the fire he had built up before she arrived, because he always got back before her on her school days, and he always had the fire ready. And this particular small fact felt to her like something very large. She began to show unmistakably in December, and her students noticed with the frank curiosity of children and asked questions that she answered with the same plain honesty she applied to everything. One of the younger girls, a small, intense child named Abigail who had been reading since age 5 and was currently working through the donated history books at a pace that would exhaust the supply by spring, asked if Mrs. Reed was happy about the baby. Frances told her yes, very much. Abigail nodded and went back to her book with the satisfied expression of a person who has verified an important fact. Harlan had begun in the evenings to build things for the child. He built a cradle from good oak with the same meticulous care he brought to all woodwork, sanding it to a smoothness that seemed excessive for something a baby would use and was, actually, Frances thought, entirely in keeping with the man he was. He did not believe in doing things partially or adequately. He built a rocking chair for her, too, not because she had asked but because he had thought it through and determined that she would need it. And when he brought it into the kitchen and set it by the fire, she ran her hand over the smooth armrests and felt the same feeling she had felt when he had handed her the history book, the particular gratitude of being known. She read to him in the evenings, from the natural history, and from a novel she had been sent by a friend in Wichita, and from a volume of poetry that she suspected might not be entirely to his taste, but which he listened to with perfect attention anyway. Sometimes she would stop mid-sentence and look up and find him watching her face rather than listening to the words, and she would raise an eyebrow and he would simply not look away, steady and entirely unembarrassed. "What are you looking at?" she asked once. "You," he said. "I can see that." "Why?" He considered it with the seriousness he gave to her real questions. "Because I spent 5 years not looking at anything closely," he said. "I am making up for it." Their son was born on a cold, clear morning in March of 1884, arriving in the world with considerable noise and healthy lungs, and a specific expression of outrage that made the midwife laugh and Frances think, through the exhaustion and the wonder of it, that he was going to be a person with opinions. Harlan had been in the kitchen through the labor, close enough to be useful and far enough to be out of the way, a balance that required, Frances reflected later, some thought. When the midwife called him in, he came to the bedside and looked at the small and indignant new person in Frances's arms with the expression of a man for whom the world has just rearranged itself into a new configuration, and who is examining it with absolute, complete attention. He sat on the edge of the bed carefully, mindful of her, and reached out and touched the baby's fist with one finger, and the baby grabbed his finger in the instinctive total grip of the newborn. Harlan did not say anything, but Frances, who had been studying his face for over a year and knew it as well as she knew anything, saw him decide something in that moment. Saw him choose the future completely and without reservation. "What will we call him?" she asked. He looked at her. "I thought," he said carefully, "if you were willing, Cole." She had expected it or something like it. She reached over and put her hand over his, the one still held by the small grabbing fist. "Cole Reed," she said. "Yes, absolutely yes." He pressed his lips together. She saw him working very hard to be contained and then saw him decide not to be. He reached over and put his arm around her shoulders and his forehead went down against her hair, and he held them both, her and Cole, together, with the careful ferocity of a man who has learned the weight of loss and is choosing love anyway. Cole Reed was a loud and curious and marvelously healthy baby who grew into a loud and curious and marvelously healthy toddler, and demanded the same thorough attention from the world that he had apparently expected from the moment of his arrival. He was entranced by horses from the age of approximately 8 months, and spent a great deal of his first 2 years attempting to get near them, which required consistent supervision and a fence reinforcement that Harlan undertook with characteristic thoroughness. Frances went back to teaching that autumn, when Cole was 6 months old, bringing him to the Aldermans on her teaching days, where Ruth managed him with the practiced ease of a woman on her 5th child, and seemed to find him more entertainment than burden. On Saturdays, Frances took him to the school and let him sit on the floor with the younger children while she worked on preparations for the week, and there was a period when Cole's primary social interaction was with children ranging from 6 to 15, and this produced in him, Frances thought, a rather interesting range of conversational skills. Harlan taught him to sit a horse at age 2, which was early, but Cole had been attempting to climb into the paddock for months, and it seemed safer to introduce them formally. He sat in front of his father on the broad back of the bay mare and gripped the saddle horn, and his expression was one of complete satisfaction, and Harlan's expression, behind him, was one that Frances, watching from the fence, had to look away from briefly because it was too complete and true to look at directly. Caldwell in 1885 was a town in the process of becoming something more settled, and the process was not entirely smooth. The Indian Territory to the south was a constant pressure, people pushing against the boundaries, the Cherokee Strip being eyed by settlers who wanted land, and by the federal government trying to manage a situation it had created badly, and was now trying to manage carefully. Harlan, who had ridden that country as a younger man, talked about it with Frances in the evenings with the precise unhappiness of someone who understood both the human longing for land and the human cost of taking it from others. "It is not a new story," Frances said. "It is the same story that has been told all the way across the continent." "No," he agreed. "And telling it the same way keeps producing the same ending." She wrote a letter to the school board about including the history of the Plains nations in the curriculum as a matter of truth rather than sentiment. The school board considered it for 2 months and then approved it with modifications, which was approximately what she had expected. She taught it anyway fully, because the modifications were the sort that could be reasonably interpreted broadly. She was with child again by the spring of 1885, which she told Harlan on a morning very similar to the one 2 years before, standing in the kitchen, directly and clearly, watching him receive it with the same complete attention and the same quality of stillness that was not absence but presence. This time he did not need to set his hat down. He simply looked at her for a moment and then said, "Good," with the complete weight of the word. "Good," she agreed. Their second child, a daughter born that December, they named Ellen, which had been Frances's mother's name, and she arrived in the world with considerably less outrage than her brother had and considerably more apparent serenity, looking at the ceiling of the bedroom with the air of someone making an assessment. Cole, who was 2, regarded his sister with intense suspicion for approximately 3 weeks, and then appointed himself her primary protector, and took this role with the seriousness that he applied to everything horse-related and important. Harlan watched this development with visible amusement, which was the most amusement Frances had seen from him in any single expression. The farm had grown. The 40 acres had expanded to 60 after they bought the adjacent parcel from a homesteader who was moving back east, defeated by the weather and the distance. And the additional land meant additional work, but also additional stability. Harlan was a good farmer and a methodical one, and what the farm produced was sufficient and often more than sufficient. And what was more than sufficient they sold, and what they sold they saved, and the savings they applied carefully to the future. Frances taught she would not stop. She had renegotiated her contract twice, and had by now taught most of the children in Cedar Creek Township, and a good number of the adults who attended the evening reading classes she had established in 1884 with the school board's permission, and a lantern she had purchased herself. The evening classes were largely attended by the families of farm workers, by people who had come west from places where schooling was not available or not permitted to them, and by a few older men who had spent their whole lives being ashamed of something they could now, quietly and without comment, address. Harlan attended one of the evening classes on a night when the regular reading tutor was unwell, sitting in the back and listening to Frances work with patience and skill and complete lack of condescension, and afterward he said, on the ride home through the winter dark, that she was the most genuinely useful person he had ever known. She told him that was the best compliment she had ever received. He looked over at her. "I mean it absolutely." "I know you do," she said. "That is why it is the best." Cole Reed, at 5 years old, was a person of strong convictions and irrepressible energy, who could identify 15 different horses by their stride from a distance, and who was learning to read with a determination that Frances suspected owed something to competitive instinct, because he had noticed that his 2-year-old sister seemed to be picking up letters faster than he had at her age, and this was apparently unacceptable. He sat at the kitchen table in the evenings with his slate and his letters with the focused scowl of someone engaged in serious business. Harlan sat across from him sometimes, not to help but simply to be present, and Cole would look up occasionally to check that his father was watching, and Harlan would give him the small nod that meant he was, and Cole would return to his letters with renewed determination. These evenings were among Frances's most vivid memories, catalogued with the precision of someone who knew they were lucky and intended to know it completely. The kitchen warm and lit by the lamp. Ellen building small towers from blocks and knocking them down, Cole with his slate, Harlan with whatever needed mending or sharpening or thinking through, the fire. The sound of the wind outside making the warmth inside more present, her own book or her lesson plans spread out on the table, and the whole particular texture of a life that was full and real and entirely hers. She thought about Thomas sometimes, with a tenderness uncomplicated by grief now, the clean memory of someone who had been good and was gone. She thought he would have found this life too hard, and she thought that was not a criticism but simply a fact, and that she had not been, at 22, the person she had needed to become in order to live it. She was grateful for the roundabout way she had arrived. In 1887, when Cole was 3 and Ellen barely 2, there was a drought that hit the Kansas plains with the flat and methodical cruelty of a thing that simply continues to not happen. Not one catastrophic absence of rain, but weeks of it, then months, the sky clear and enormous and indifferent, and the soil going from dry to baked to something that cracked underfoot. The creek on their eastern boundary went low and then lower, and Harlan spent the summer in a state of careful management, conserving water, rotating the animals, making decisions with the practiced calm of someone who had seen bad things before and understood that survival was a matter of consistent attention rather than dramatic action. Other farms failed that year, or came close. The Aldermans had a hard season, and Frances saw Ruth's face drawn with worry in a way she had not seen before. Harlan helped them, not conspicuously, not in the way that makes the helped party feel diminished, but in the specific and practical way of a man who shows up when there is work to be done and does it, and does not calculate what is owed. Frances organized the evening class students into a food-sharing arrangement that she described, when the school board asked about it, as a practical lesson in community economics, which it also genuinely was. She sent to Wichita for materials she knew could be obtained there, and arranged the transportation herself. She argued, at a town meeting in August that she had not been invited to but attended anyway, that the township needed to address the distribution of water rights before next summer, or the drought would take 3 times as many farms. The town meeting was initially surprised by her presence and her argument, but she was by then 6 years into her tenure as the only teacher most of their children had ever known, and she had a reputation for saying things that were accurate. So, after a moment's adjustment, the meeting proceeded with her argument included. Harlan had been in the back of the meeting room. He was one of perhaps 30 people. He said nothing. When the meeting was over and people were filing out and 3 different men had stopped to tell Frances she had made a strong case, he waited until they had all passed, and then he looked at her with the full weight of his expression and said one word. "Right," he said, meaning she had been. She smiled. "You could have said something," she said. "You know more about water management on this land than anyone in that room." "You were doing fine," he said. "Harlan." "Next time," he said. And the next time there was a town meeting on the water rights. He was sitting at the front table, having been appointed to the committee, and he said everything he knew about the subject with the precise efficiency of a man who does not waste words and therefore makes each one count. And the committee adopted 3 of his 4 recommendations, and he regarded the 4th one's rejection as an acceptable outcome. The drought broke in October with 3 days of rain that turned the creek full again and put a different quality into the air. And Frances stood on the porch in the rain, getting slowly soaked, and felt a relief so physical it was almost embarrassing. And Harlan came out and stood beside her, and got equally wet, and neither of them went inside for a long time. The years built themselves one on another in the way that good years do, not by being without difficulty, but by being made from things that lasted. Cole started school in the autumn of 1888 and had the experience of being taught by his mother, which was a situation of some complexity that Frances navigated with professionalism, and Cole navigated by being fiercely determined to be her best student, an effort she acknowledged only privately to Harlan, who allowed himself a rare and complete smile at the report. Ellen was a different kind of child, quieter, more interior, with a gift for drawing that revealed itself when she was 3, and that Frances cultivated carefully, finding paper and proper pencils, putting them in Ellen's hands and watching what happened. What happened was that Ellen drew everything: the horses, the creek, the house, her father's hands, her brother's scowl, the particular shape of the horizon that surrounded their life. By the time she was 5, her drawings were recognizable as art in the way that transcends the category of child's drawing, and Frances showed one to the school board not to show off, but to ask whether there was any provision for art instruction, which there was not, but which she intended to change. Harlan kept a drawing Ellen had done of him on the wall of the kitchen, in a simple frame he had made. It showed him standing at the paddock fence looking at the horizon, which was what he had been doing when Ellen drew it, and it captured something specific and true about the quality of his stillness that Frances found, every time she looked at it, quietly remarkable. Her daughter had seen what she herself had seen on the first day, the quality of a man who was present to the world in the way that mattered. In the spring of 1889, the Cherokee Strip opened to settlement, not immediately and not without enormous conflict, and not without cost to the people it had been taken from, and Caldwell, which had been the last town before that line for decades, became suddenly less of an edge and more of a center. The town grew and changed, and a new generation of settlers poured through it, and the school doubled its enrollment in a single year, and the school board, finally, hired a second teacher, which freed Frances to take on the advanced students and create, essentially, an upper school in the 2 available rooms. She was 33 years old and more alive in her work than she had ever been, and she came home every evening to a house where the lamp was lit, and the fire was going, and Harlan was putting supper together. Because he had learned to cook early in their marriage on the grounds that she worked longer hours than he did on school days, and it was not sensible for her to also cook, and he had become, through application and persistence, genuinely good at it. Cole was 5 now, long and serious, with Harlan's eyes and Frances's directness, and a way of standing that was already beginning to look like his father. Ellen was 3 and drew everything in reach. The house had been added onto twice, acquiring a proper bedroom for the children and a small room that functioned partly as a study, where Frances kept her books and her lesson plans, and where Harlan sometimes sat in the evening just to be near her when she worked, not intruding, simply present. There was an evening in the autumn of 1889 when Cole came home from school. He was in her class, which had its documented complications, but he was also the most relentless reader she had ever taught, which she regarded as a form of justice, with a question that had apparently been occupying him all day. He sat at the kitchen table with his boots still on, which was a violation, and fixed his father with the specific look of a person who has decided on an important line of inquiry. "Pa," he said, "Miss Whitmore says the drives are finished. She says there won't be any more cattle drives coming through Caldwell. Is that right?" Harlan looked at his son for a moment. "Close enough to right," he said. "Did you ever ride them, the drives?" "Yes." "What were they like?" There was a pause. Frances, at the kitchen counter, went still without appearing to. Harlan put down the thing he had been working on and turned to face his son and said, "Come sit with me and I will tell you." And he told him. All of it, the vastness of the herds, the nights under open sky, the work of it, the particular community of it, the way it felt to be part of something that enormous and transient and real. He told Cole about Cole's uncle, whose name their son carried, about the kind of man he had been and the ride he had made and what the drives had meant to both of them. He talked for a long time. Cole listened without moving, with the attentiveness that was his father's in the particular way that sons carry their father's qualities. Frances stood at the counter and listened to her husband talk, and she thought about a flat rock on a creek in September 7 years ago, and about a question, and about the way some people carry the most important things inside them for years until someone asks the right question, and then cannot stop. She thought about the particular privilege of being the person who had asked. Ellen wandered in from somewhere and climbed into her father's lap halfway through his account of a river crossing, and he shifted to accommodate her without pausing, and she put her head against his chest and went slowly to sleep with the perfect trust of children who have never had reason to be afraid. And he talked on with one arm around her and his eyes on Cole, and something in the quality of his voice that Frances could only describe as free. Later, when Cole had gone to bed and Ellen was already asleep, and the kitchen was quiet and the fire was low, Frances sat across from Harlan at the table with her hands around a cup of tea and said, "Cole's face when you talked about the drives." "I know," he said. "He is going to want to go out there." "I know that too," he said. "Good." He looked at her. "The world should still have people who want to go out there, even if what they find is different from what I found." She looked at him across the table. This man she had been building a life with for 6 years and would keep building it with for the rest of both their lives, and thought about how different he was from the person she had almost not seen. How easy it would have been to look at the silence and see only absence rather than depth. How easy to mistake containment for emptiness. She thought about what Ruth had said that first autumn, that she had never doubted he was a good man, which was worth more than conversation. Ruth had been right, but it was also true that conversation, real conversation, honest and asking and willing to receive, was what had opened the door between them, and that without it they might have lived in the same house forever and never known each other. She said, "I am glad I asked you that question." He looked at her steadily. "What question?" "What you think about when you are being quiet." He was quiet for a moment, not the old quiet, the living one. "So am I," he said, "every day." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. His hand turned over and held hers. Outside the farmhouse window, the Kansas sky was doing what it always did, enormous and indifferent and full of stars, and entirely indifferent to human scale, which was one of the things Frances had come to love about it, the way it put things in proportion. They were very small in it, she and Harlan and their children and their 60 acres and their school and their creek and their life. But the size of a thing was not the measure of its worth, and she had learned that more here than anywhere. Cole turned 6 in March of 1890, and his birthday present from his father was a proper introduction to the horses, not just sitting in front of Harlan as a passenger, but holding his own reins on the quietest of their 3 horses, a gray mare named Patience who had earned her name, and going around the paddock under his father's close and entirely calm supervision. He was gloriously happy about this. He came inside that evening with hay in his hair and boots that needed immediate attention and an expression of complete satisfaction. Ellen drew the whole thing from the fence, a series of small, precise drawings that captured her brother's growing confidence in each successive loop around the paddock. She gave them to Harlan at supper, laid out in order, and he looked at them for a long time and then looked at her and said, "Thank you, Ellen." She nodded with the gravity of a person presenting an important document. Frances had been approached by the state education department that year. A letter, somewhat formal, asking whether she would be willing to correspond with them about the curriculum improvements she had implemented in Cedar Creek, as several of the graduates of her school had gone on to educational institutions and had been notably well prepared. She showed the letter to Harlan over supper, and he read it twice and then put it down with the expression she had come to know as the one he wore when he was genuinely proud but had no desire to perform it. "You should write to them," he said. "It will take time." "Write to them," he said. She wrote a 12-page letter that was probably more thorough than expected, covering the evening reading classes and the arts integration and the multi-age tutoring system and the history curriculum expansion and the water rights lesson that had, she noted, prepared several of her older students to engage with practical local governance before they were 20. The State Department wrote back requesting a meeting. Frances went to Topeka on the train in November, having arranged for 2 weeks' worth of lessons in advance, and having left Harlan with a list of instructions for the children's schoolwork that he reviewed with the patient expression of a man who is being told things he already knows, but who understands that the list is about something other than the information it contains. He managed excellently. Cole read 3 books. Ellen drew their father in 17 different poses, examining them with an artist's critical attention and keeping only 4. When Frances came home on the evening train, the house was clean and supper was made, and Cole greeted her at the door with a recitation of everything he had learned in her absence, and Ellen presented her with the 4 drawings, and Harlan took her coat and the bag she had carried and said, simply, "How was it?" "Productive," she said. "They want to use some of what we have done here as a model for other rural schools." He nodded. He poured her a cup of coffee. He sat down across from her and said, "Tell me." She told him everything, all 12 days of meetings and conversations and arguments and agreements, and he listened with his whole attention and asked the right questions, and by the end of it she felt, as she always felt after talking to him, both fully heard and newly clear. "You should be pleased," he said. "I am." "Good," he said, and then after a pause, "I missed you." She looked at him across the kitchen table with the lamp between them. "I missed you too," she said. "Every day." He nodded, not accepting it as a simple fact, but receiving it as the specific and genuine thing it was. Their 3rd child came in 1891, a second son they named James for no particular reason, except that both of them had always liked the name, and that Cole's initial response to the suggestion of a baby brother had been a considered nod that suggested this might be acceptable if the brother proved competent. James arrived in the world with somewhat less noise than Cole had made and considerably more deliberation than Ellen, taking his time about it, and then opening his eyes, and looking at the world with an assessment that made the midwife say she had never seen a baby look so thoughtful. Harlan held him in the careful, deliberate way he held things that mattered, and said his name once quietly, and James, who was approximately 4 hours old, appeared to consider this acceptable. Cole was 7, and adopted the role of senior sibling with the thoroughness he applied to everything. Ellen was 5 and drew James immediately and from every angle, and presented the drawings to Frances with the same documentary gravity she brought to all her artwork. The years ahead of them were long and full of the things that fill years: work and weather and children growing, and the particular satisfactions of a life that has been built rather than inherited. The school kept growing. Harlan's farm kept producing. Cole grew into a young man with his father's steadiness and his mother's directness and a love of horses that was entirely his own. Ellen grew into an artist who was also, under Frances's guidance, a serious reader, and who had by the age of 12 filled 3 books with drawings that the teacher in Frances recognized as genuinely significant. James grew into the thoughtful person his newborn expression had suggested, slower to speak than his siblings but deeper when he did, with a quality of observation that sometimes made Frances think she was seeing Harlan from a new angle. The life they had made together in 60 Kansas acres and 1 schoolroom and the evenings of the kitchen with the lamp going was not a grand one in the way that stories sometimes made lives grand. No one rode into the sunset. No fortunes were made. The land was not tamed. It remained itself, enormous and particular and demanding, the Kansas sky doing its vast indifferent thing above them regardless of what they made of it. But it was a life completely and thoroughly inhabited, lived without waste, built from honest materials. It was a life where words meant what they said and work was a form of love, and love was demonstrated in the consistent and unspectacular actions of daily devotion: coffee set out in the morning, fires built before they were needed, children watched with the full weight of attention, questions asked and answered and asked again. On an evening in the late autumn of 1892, when Cole was 8 and Ellen was 6 and James was 1.5 and the farm had had its second good year running, and the school was the best it had ever been, and the creek was full, and the cottonwoods along it had gone gold in the last of the season's warmth, Harlan and Frances sat on the porch after the children were in bed and watched the stars come out over the prairie the way they had been watching stars together for 9 years. He had his arm around her and she had her head against his shoulder, and the night was cold enough to see their breath, but neither of them was ready to go inside. "Are you happy?" she asked. He did not answer immediately. He thought about it in the way he thought about things that deserved real thought, turning it over, examining it honestly. "Yes," he said, "completely." She settled further into his side. "Tell me something. What would you like to know?" "Anything," she said. "You have been quiet all day." He was quiet for another moment, the living quiet, the considering one. Then he said, "I was thinking about Cole's uncle, about the fact that Cole is 8 years old now." Cole, my brother, at 8 years old, was already the funniest person I had ever met. He could make a whole bunkhouse laugh. I was thinking about what he would say if he could see this. She waited. "I think he would say," Harlan continued slowly, "that it took me long enough." She smiled against his shoulder. "He would be right." "He was usually right," Harlan said. "He was better at most things than me. He would have been better at this too, at being happy. It would have taken him less time." "But you got there," she said. "Yes," he said. "I got here, not there, here, the present tense and the specific place." She lifted her head and looked at him in the dark, at the familiar profile of him, the set of his jaw, the quality of his stillness that she had once read as distance and now knew as depth. She put her hand against his face the way he had put his hand against hers on the night he had first kissed her, with the same deliberateness, the same genuine weight. He turned and looked at her. "You talk more now," she said, "than you did. You gave me things worth saying," he said. She kissed him on the cold porch in the dark with the stars above them and the prairie silent all around, and the sound of their sleeping children faint through the kitchen window. And he held her with the same care and completeness that he had always held the things he valued, without performance, without excess, with the full and exact measure of what was true. She had come to Caldwell with 37 cents and a carpet bag, and a question she had not known she was carrying. He had been here already, carrying something heavier, waiting without knowing he was waiting. She had asked the right question at the right moment on a flat rock by a creek in September, and he had answered it, and had not been able to stop. And the answer had kept going, had grown into a life, and a house, and 3 children and 60 acres of Kansas soil, and 9 years of evenings with the lamp lit, and the fire going, and all the words that a man accumulates when he has finally found the person worth speaking them to. Inside the house, James woke briefly in his cradle and made a small sound, and then was quiet. Cole turned in his sleep. Ellen dreamed, probably in images. Frances and Harlan stayed on the porch a while longer in no hurry, the stars continuing their patient work above them. The Kansas night was wide and cold and full of everything, the distance and the dark and the particular freedom of a place that does not pretend to be other than what it is. They were exactly where they were, and it was exactly enough, and they both knew it, and they said so in the only way that mattered, by staying, by remaining present to each other and to the life they had made together, by choosing it again in the accumulated small moments of every ordinary day. The creek moved over its stones in the dark somewhere to the east, unhurried and continuous, the sound of it carrying through the cold air, something that had been there before them and would be there after them and did not require anything of them except that they notice it was beautiful. Harlan noticed. Frances noticed him noticing. And the night held them in the vast and honest dark of the Kansas frontier. A woman and a man who had found each other at the particular edge between the old world and the new, in the last years of the wild and vanishing West, and had built something from the meeting that was real and lasting, and entirely their own.